All right, everybody, welcome back to News and Views on YouTube for another deep dive with me.
And me.
All right, so we are diving into some pretty wild news out of Canada today.
Yeah.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau
Mm-hmm.
has announced that he is resigning,
Yes.
stepping down from his position.
Huge news.
Big news.
Yeah.
And we have a whole stack of articles and analyses here to try to figure this out.
Yeah, break it down.
So I think right off the bat, there are three major things that we need to hit.
Okay.
Number one, this resignation comes just weeks before Donald Trump is set to take office again as the U.S. president.
Oh, wow.
And, Trump has been publicly talking about those tariffs
Yes.
on Canadian goods.
Right.
So that's going to be interesting to watch.
Okay.
Number two, this resignation paves the way for the Conservative Party of Canada, led by Pierre Poilievre,
Yep.
to potentially take power,
Big change.
which would be a very big change for Canada.
Definitely.
And then number three, this is crazy.
Okay, what is it?
Trump is even
Oh, no.
about Canada just becoming the 51st state.
Really?
So
I don't know. It's a lot.
that's a lot.
It's a lot to dive into.
It is.
Right.
Where do we even begin?
So Trudeau announced his resignation on January 6th, 2025,
Just a few days ago.
just a couple days ago.
Wow.
After 9 years in power.
A long time.
Yeah, a long time.
It's going to be a big adjustment.
Yeah, and he, in his announcement, he cited internal battles within the Liberal Party
Mm-hmm.
and said that he wanted to give Canadians a, quote, real choice
Mm.
in the upcoming election.
Okay.
He did take some time to highlight some achievements from his time as Prime Minister.
I'd be curious to know what he chose to highlight.
Yeah, so he brought up the legalization of cannabis,
Okay.
the introduction of a carbon tax,
Right.
and his advocacy for Indigenous rights.
Okay. Those are some pretty big things.
Yeah, definitely.
It seems like he's trying to really emphasize his legacy
I guess so.
in a way.
Yeah.
These are the things I want to be remembered for.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though, because while he's focusing on these accomplishments, there's also this sense that he's stepping down because things weren't going so well.
Right.
There's more to the story.
Yeah. I mean, why now?
Right, exactly.
Why resign now?
It just seems sudden.
Yeah.
What's the real reason?
Yeah. So let's dive into that a little bit.
Okay.
So,
What are some of the factors that might have led to this?
well, one thing that we can't ignore is the fact that Trudeau's approval ratings had been declining for a while.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So back in 2015,
When he was first elected.
when he was first elected, super popular.
Yeah, everyone loved him,
Yeah. I mean, it was
especially internationally.
yeah, internationally, he was like a star.
Mm-hmm.
But by the end of 2024, his approval rating had plummeted. I mean,
Sure.
we're talking down into the low 20s.
That's pretty significant.
Yeah, it's a big drop.
So what caused that, I wonder?
I think, it's hard to say for certain, but it
Yeah.
seems like a lot of Canadians were just not happy with how he was handling the economy,
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
especially in the wake of the pandemic,
Right.
dealing with inflation,
Mm-hmm.
unemployment.
Still an issue.
Yeah, and those rising housing costs
It's a big issue everywhere.
everywhere.
Yeah.
But Trudeau did mention those internal struggles within his party.
Right.
So, what was going on there?
Well, it seems like it wasn't just an excuse.
Okay.
The Liberal Party was having some real internal conflicts, and it all kind of came to a head in December when Chrystia Freeland,
Oh, yeah.
who was the deputy prime minister,
Right.
and the finance minister resigned.
Wow.
Big deal.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
And from what we understand, she had some major disagreements with Trudeau, and her departure was definitely a blow to his leadership.
So it sounds like he was facing pressure from all sides,
Yeah, it's no
inside and outside the party.
inside, outside.
Yeah.
And don't forget the scandals.
Oh, yeah.
I think those definitely played a role.
Yeah, I mean, the groping accusation, the blackface, brownface incidents, the conflict of interest violation with that whole vacation thing.
Right.
I mean, all of that stuff definitely chipped away at his image.
Yeah, no matter how much he tried to smooth things over,
Right.
it definitely made him more vulnerable,
Yeah. And speaking of vulnerable, the opposition has definitely been taking advantage of that.
for sure.
So let's talk about the Conservatives.
Okay.
They're led by Pierre Poilievre,
Yeah.
and they have been gaining a lot of ground in the polls.
It seems like they've been waiting for this moment.
Yeah, and now they're really in a prime position to potentially win the next election.
Interesting.
And Poilievre is a much more conservative leader.
Than Trudeau, for sure.
Yeah, than Trudeau.
Much more fiscally focused.
Mm-hmm.
And some would say that he's more in line with the kind of populism that we've seen from Donald Trump in the U.S.
Right, and that brings us to the big question mark.
Which is Trump's back.
He is back.
What's that going to mean?
What's that going to mean for Canada?
Yeah, because he and Trudeau did not have the best relationship.
Right. I mean, Trump has publicly called Trudeau a governor.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And like even joked about Canada becoming the 51st state.
That's just bizarre.
Yeah, and then there's that whole threat of the 25% tariffs on Canadian goods.
Right, which would be devastating for the Canadian economy.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah.
A lot of uncertainty.
For sure.
So I guess the big question is,
Yeah.
with Trudeau gone, who is going to stand up to Trump?
Who's going to step in?
And who's going to protect Canada's interests?
Big shoes to fill.
Yeah.
It'll be very interesting to see who the Liberal Party chooses as their new leader.
Right, they're going to have to choose quickly.
They don't have a lot of time.
Yeah.
And they need to find someone who can really handle the pressure.
Yeah, someone strong.
Someone who can hold their own.
Right, yeah.
Against both the Conservatives and Trump.
It's a tall order.
For sure.
All right, so let's
Okay.
let's move on and take a look at some of the potential contenders.
Okay, who are we thinking?
For Trudeau's job.
Yeah, who's in the running?
So there are a few big names that are being tossed around.
I bet.
First up, we had Chrystia Freeland.
Oh, right.
You know, she was the deputy prime minister and finance minister.
She was.
Until she resigned in December.
Right.
But even though she resigned, she's still considered a front runner.
Yeah, because of her experience.
Right. I mean, she's got the name recognition,
Right.
the experience, the political know-how.
She's a strong contender.
Yeah.
For sure.
So then there's also Dominic LeBlanc,
Okay.
who is the current finance minister.
Mm-hmm.
He has been a close ally of Trudeau.
Yeah, for a long time.
For a long time.
So he's definitely familiar with the inner workings of the party.
Yeah, I think he'd be seen as like the continuity candidate.
Right.
Like he'd be able to steady the ship and maintain Trudeau's legacy.
Yeah.
And then there's also Melanie Joly, foreign minister. And she's been playing a very prominent role on the world stage.
Especially with everything going on in Ukraine.
Right, exactly.
So she's got a lot of experience with international relations.
Yeah.
Which could be crucial right now.
Yeah, with everything going on.
Especially with Trump back in the picture.
Yeah.
That international experience is going to be really important.
Definitely.
So we've got Freeland, LeBlanc, Joly, all experienced politicians.
Yep.
Anyone else in the mix?
Well, there's one more name that's been making the rounds.
Okay, tell me.
Mark Carney.
Mark Carney.
He's the former governor of the Bank of Canada.
Oh, wow.
And the Bank of England.
The banker.
The banker.
That's an interesting choice.
Yeah. I mean, he's definitely a wild card.
He is.
But he does have some serious economic credentials.
Yeah, that's for sure.
But whether that translates into political success is another question.
Right. Like, can he connect with voters?
Right. Can he actually win an election?
It's a whole different game.
Yeah. It's a whole different game.
So it sounds like the Liberal Party has some tough choices to make.
Yeah.
This leadership race is going to be fascinating.
Yeah, and it's not just about replacing Trudeau.
Right.
It's about the future direction
of the party.
Of the Liberal Party and potentially Canada.
Exactly, because whoever they choose is going to have a huge impact on the country's future.
Yeah. All right, so before we get into that, let's...
what else do we need to cover?
Let's take a quick look at the reactions to Trudeau's resignation.
Oh, yeah. What are people saying?
So what are people saying?
What's the general consensus?
Well, it's been a mixed bag.
I bet.
As you might expect.
Yeah. I mean, it's a big change.
Yeah.
People are going to have different opinions.
So some people are sad to see him go.
Makes sense.
You know, they acknowledge his accomplishments and appreciate what he's done for Canada. Others are happy to see him step down.
Right. They feel like it's time for a change.
Yeah.
Fresh start.
Fresh start. And they think that a new leader can better address the challenges that Canada's facing.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. Yeah. Every leader has their strengths and weaknesses.
Right.
It's just the nature of the job.
And what about internationally? How are people reacting?
Well, there's been a lot of international coverage.
Not bad.
With analysts trying to figure out what this means for Canada's relationship with the rest of the world.
Right.
And of course, everyone's talking about Trump's reaction.
Oh, yeah.
That whole suggestion about Canada becoming the 51st state.
Right.
I mean, most people dismissed it as absurd.
Yeah.
But it does highlight the uncertainty surrounding Canada's future.
For sure.
It's a big question mark.
Yeah. So a lot to unpack here.
We've got a lot to unpack.
We've got a new political landscape in Canada with Trudeau gone.
Yep.
The Conservatives are rising. And Trump is back in the picture.
Big changes.
So where does Canada go from here?
That's the million-dollar question. And to really answer that, I think we need to dig a little deeper into the forces at play, the challenges that Canada is facing, and the potential impact of all these political shifts.
We've got a lot more to cover.
We do.
So let's
dive back in.
Let's dive right back in.
Okay.
All right. So
we were talking about the future of Canada and this whole idea of it shifting to a more like populist right-wing direction with the Conservatives and Poilievre.
yeah, is this like a global trend, or is Canada kind of unique in this?
I think what's happening in Canada is definitely part of a larger global trend.
Yeah.
We've seen this rise of populist movements in a lot of different countries, all around the world. I mean, from Europe to South America, it seems to be a reaction to a lot of things, like economic anxieties, cultural shifts, and this general feeling that, like, the traditional institutions and political parties aren't really working for everyday people.
Yeah. So how does that translate to Canada specifically? What are some of the key issues that are driving this shift there?
Well, we talked about the economy a little bit, and I think that's a huge factor. I mean, the cost of living has been going up and up, and wages haven't been keeping pace. So people are feeling squeezed, and they're looking for someone to blame.
Yeah.
Housing in particular has become a major problem, especially in the big cities like Toronto and Vancouver, where it's just become almost impossible for a lot of people to afford to live.
Yeah. And I've heard that immigration is a big issue in Canada, too. Is that something that Poilievre is tapping into?
Yeah, immigration is definitely a key part of Poilievre's message. He's tapping into this idea that Canadian culture and values are being eroded by too much immigration too quickly. It's a complex issue. Yeah. And there are valid arguments on both sides, but Poilievre has been really effective at using it to, like, rally support.
It's interesting that you bring up the economy and immigration, because those are also issues that Trump really focused on.
Exactly.
During his campaigns in the U.S.
Yeah, there are definitely some parallels there. And there are other similarities, too. Like, for example, Poilievre has been very critical of Trudeau's environmental policies, arguing that they hurt the economy and that Canada shouldn't be leading the charge on fighting climate change.
Which is kind of similar to Trump's.
Exactly. It aligns with Trump's skepticism of climate change and his focus on economic growth.
Right.
Even if it comes at the expense of the environment.
And haven't both Poilievre and Trump been really good at using social media to connect with supporters?
Yes, that's another key similarity. Both of them have mastered this art of, like, bypassing traditional media and speaking directly to people through social media. It lets them control their own narrative and build these really loyal followings of people who feel like they're getting the unvarnished truth. Even if that truth is often, distorted or misleading.
So it sounds like there are some real concerns about how a Poilievre government could impact Canada's relationship with the U.S. Is there a chance things could get even more complicated?
Yeah, it's definitely a possibility. I mean, on the one hand, Poilievre's admiration for Trump and his alignment with a lot of Trump's policies could lead to a closer relationship, at least on the surface.
Okay.
But on the other hand, Trump has shown that he can be very unpredictable and even hostile towards his allies.
Yeah.
So even if Poilievre tries to play nice, there's no guarantee that Trump would reciprocate.
Right. And let's not forget that Poilievre doesn't really have any experience on the world stage.
That's a good point.
Trudeau, for all his faults, was a seasoned diplomat.
He was.
He knew how to navigate international relations.
Yeah.
It's hard to know how Poilievre would handle that kind of pressure and complexity.
Absolutely. And there's also the question of how Canada's relationships with other countries might be affected. I mean, Trudeau, with his focus on multilateralism and progressive values, was seen as a leader.
Right.
On the world stage, it's unclear whether Poilievre would continue that tradition.
Right.
Or whether Canada would become more isolated under his leadership.
So all of this would obviously have a pretty big impact on the average Canadian.
It would.
What are some of the things they should be thinking about as they watch all this political drama unfold?
I think the most important thing is for Canadians to be engaged in the democratic process.
Okay.
Stay informed and make their voices heard. The choices that are made in the coming months, both by the Liberal Party in choosing their new leader and by Canadians in the next election, are going to shape the country's future for years to come.
You mentioned earlier that the economy is a big concern.
It is.
For a lot of Canadians.
Huge concern.
Can you talk a bit more about that? What are some of the specific challenges that people are facing?
Well, we already touched on the rising cost of living.
Right.
Stagnant wages. the housing crisis.
Mm-hmm.
But those are really just the tip of the iceberg. I think there's also this growing sense of economic inequality
Yeah.
with the gap between the rich and the poor widening, and that's leading to a lot of frustration and resentment.
Right.
And it's something that Poilievre has been really good at tapping into with his populist message.
And what about social cohesion?
Yeah.
Canada has always prided itself on being a multicultural society, but it sounds like that's being challenged right now.
Yeah, there's a growing sense, fueled in part by Poilievre's rhetoric, that immigration is happening too quickly and that it's threatening Canadian identity. And that's a dangerous narrative.
Yeah.
One that can easily lead to division and intolerance, and it's something that Canadians need to be very wary of.
So what can Canadians do? How can they make their voices heard and make sure that their concerns are addressed?
I think the first step is to stay informed. Read a variety of news sources, engage in thoughtful discussions, and don't be afraid to challenge people who are spreading misinformation or fear-mongering. And of course, when the time comes, vote.
Right.
I mean, the power of democracy lies in the hands of the people.
Yeah.
And it's up to Canadians to choose the leaders and the policies that they believe will best serve their interests.
Okay, so let's zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture here.
Okay.
Trudeau's resignation obviously goes beyond just Canada. How does this fit into the global political landscape?
That's a big question.
What does this mean for the future of things like democracy, multilateralism, the fight against climate change?
Well, Trudeau, despite his flaws, was seen by many as a champion of progressive values, a leader who stood up for human rights, environmental protection, international cooperation, and his departure, coupled with the rise of populist leaders like Trump and Poilievre, suggests this trend towards a more inward-looking nationalistic approach to politics.
Right.
And that could have a ripple effect around the world.
It feels like we're at a turning point.
I think we are. There's no doubt about it. The rise of populism is a complex phenomenon with deep roots in economic inequality, social division, a loss of trust in traditional institutions, and it's something that we need to understand not just in the context of Canada, but in the context of the world.
Yeah, because the choices that we make individually and collectively are going to determine what kind of world we want to live in.
Exactly.
It's a lot to think about.
That is.
And I'm sure our listeners are eager to hear more about what the future holds for Canada.
So we were talking about the global implications of all of this.
Yeah, and how it all fits into this rise of populism.
Right. Like, is it a coincidence or is something bigger happening?
It feels like a lot is riding on what happens next in Canada.
Yeah, it really does. And you know, what happens in Canada doesn't stay in Canada. We live in a globalized world.
Right.
And political shifts in one country can have a ripple effect across the globe. Trudeau's resignation coming right after Trump's re-election in the U.S.
Yeah.
It could embolden other populist leaders and movements around the world. It's almost like a domino effect.
So if Poilievre wins and Canada takes this sharp turn to the right, could that signal a broader shift towards populism on the international stage?
It's definitely a possibility the more these populist leaders succeed. The more legitimacy they gain and the more their message resonates with people who are feeling disillusioned with the status quo.
Yeah.
And that's a concerning trend.
For sure.
Especially for those who believe in international cooperation, human rights, democratic institutions.
Yeah, so why is that? Well, what's the issue of populism specifically when we're talking about international relations?
Well, populism by its very nature tends to be inward-looking and nationalistic.
Okay.
It often thrives on division and distrust of the other,
Right.
whether that's other countries, other cultures, or even other political parties within the same country. This can make it really difficult to build consensus and cooperate on global issues, like climate change, trade security.
Right. Okay, so back to Canada.
Yeah.
What are some realistic scenarios for the country's future? I mean, lay it out for us. What are the options?
Well, it's tough to predict the future with certainty.
Of course.
But, you know, we can explore some possibilities based on what we know.
Yeah.
So one scenario is that Poilievre wins the next election, and he fully implements his populist agenda.
Right.
This could lead to a more divided Canada with a greater emphasis on national sovereignty and a more transactional approach to foreign policy.
And what would that mean for Canadians on a practical level?
Well, it could mean a rollback of some of Trudeau's signature policies, like the carbon tax,
right,
the focus on reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. It could also mean changes to immigration policies, trade deals, social programs.
But couldn't the Liberal Party still pull off a win?
It's not impossible.
What would it take for them to stay in power?
Well, they would need to choose a strong leader.
Okay.
Someone who can unite the party and appeal to a broad spectrum of voters. They could potentially offer a compelling alternative to Poilievre's populism, but they're facing an uphill battle.
Right.
And they really need to find a leader who can inspire confidence and articulate a vision for the future that resonates with Canadians.
So a leadership race to watch, for sure. But what happens if neither party gets a clear majority?
Oh, yeah. That's always a possibility.
Right.
We could see a minority government where no single party has a majority of seats in Parliament.
Right.
This would force the parties to work together and compromise, which could lead to more moderate policies overall.
So that could be a good thing.
It's often seen as a positive outcome because it prevents any one party from having too much power.
But there are downsides too, right?
Right. Minority governments can also be unstable and prone to gridlock.
Makes sense.
Especially if the parties are too ideologically divided to find common ground. So there's no easy answer. A lot depends on how the political landscape evolves in the coming months.
It's a lot for Canadians to process.
It is.
What would you say to those feeling overwhelmed by all this change and uncertainty?
I'd say that while there's a lot of uncertainty right now, there's also an opportunity for Canadians to have their voices heard and shape the future of their country. The choices made in the coming months and years will have a profound impact, so it's important for people to stay informed, engage in thoughtful discussions, and participate in the democratic process.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive into Canadian politics.
It has.
Trudeau's resignation has certainly thrown a wrench into things.
Definitely.
And it's going to be really interesting to see what happens next.
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks for breaking it all down for us.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all of our listeners out there, thanks for joining us for another deep dive here on News and Views on YouTube.
We'll see you next time.
We'll catch you next time.